Are we warmer than we were before? Do we feel more comfortable with each other? Look at the person next to you and say, hello, beautiful person. We're going to get started in a little bit. We're hoping for the live stream to go up. But if you haven't talked to someone that you don't know, make sure you talk to someone you don't know today. Apparently the live stream's on and someone is listening to the live stream while they're here. How's everybody doing? All right, let's keep the energy up. We were chanting outside. Do y'all want to join me in a little chant? Do you want to join me in a little chant? They say more war. We say no more. But you got to act like you believe it. They say more war. We say no more. They say more war. We say no more. We say no more. How are you doing? How are our energies? We just marched in really cold weather because we need to believe that we can win. Can we win? Yes. Will we win? Yes. No to NATO? No to war? No to war. Good. Well, welcome to the People's Forum. If you haven't been in this space, welcome for the first time. If you've been here before, welcome back home. There is someone who has the live stream on in the space, and I hear the reverberation of like my own speech, and it's kind of distracting me right now. So if you could stop that and watch it later, that'd be great. We wanna thank folks that came out again in this cold weather to not only. I hate when we talk about talking truth to power. Because the people who are in quote unquote power are only powerful because we are not organized enough. Because we're not mobilizing as much as we should, and we're not building the people power that we should build. They're only powerful because we're allowing them to be powerful. And so today we spoke to who really has the power, which is the working class, the masses, and we put out the call that we should not be silent, that we will not be silent, and that we will put out the truth. And the truth is that war is our enemy, that NATO is our enemy, that the capitalist class is and will always be our enemy, that imperialism doesn't serve the people of the U.S., and that we have the responsibility to call out the U.S. government on their bullshit. Imperialism, capitalism, white supremacy is death, and we are working in the defense of human life. We are working in the defense of saving the planet. Is that what we're doing? So when we stand against war, we're defending life. And so again, thank you all so much for joining. We have a 1-hour program, so it's not going to be long. We do want folks to be able to talk to each other, get to know each other, and more importantly, if you leave the space without meeting a new person, then we didn't do our job. So make sure you meet someone new, because this is going to go beyond today. All right? Are you with me? And I keep listening to myself as I'm talking, right? So today we're gonna hear from comrades in Brazil. We're going to hear from our comrades Brian Becker and Eugene per year. But before we get to that, we would like to hear from a greeting from a comrade who has been in the anti-war movement for many years and who has fought with much integrity against imperialism and capitalism. And so we want to give the mic to our friend and comrade, Medea Benjamin from Code Pink.
So I just spent the week walking through the halls of Congress in Washington, D.C. And if you didn't know, guess what? There are 2 war parties. I don't think that's a surprise to any of you here, but it's so amazing when you go into Congress and you just try to talk a rational voice to people and say, listen to your own chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, who said, there is no military victory in Ukraine. Seize the moment, go for negotiations. And that's what we are going in the halls saying. And they say, no, we can't do this. We have to stay with Ukraine till victory. What does that mean? Getting back every inch of the Donbass and getting back Crimea, it's just not gonna happen. And so the only thing that means is that our government wants to bleed Ukraine, wants to stretch out this war, wants to weaken Russia, and wants to take more and more billions and billions of our dollars that are needed for people in the United States and to address the climate crisis, wants to use that for the war machine, to enrich the war machine more and more. And so it was beautiful being in the streets with you today and hearing that energy and seeing that determination. We know we are in the vanguard right now of the movement who knows war is not the answer. War is never the answer. So let's feel our strength today, because we are fighting not only the war machine, not only the 2 war parties in Washington, but the entire mainstream media that is trying to convince the American people that this war is a good thing for us. Come on, that is crazy. We're the ones in the right. Not the right, not like the right of the right in like the right worldview, and morally correct, thank you. And our voice is going to become stronger and stronger as their position becomes weaker and weaker. And the last thing I just want to say is that I've been spending also the week talking to people throughout Europe that are the ones that are experiencing the blowback from this war and the sanctions. And they are planning big demonstrations in the street. They have the trade unions on their side. They have the ordinary people who are feeling the pinch of their energy prices going up, of the trying to get food in the market and the prices going up. And they're saying we're getting lots and lots and lots of more people coming out to say no to NATO, to say no to this war in Ukraine, and to say we are part of the global voices, including the majority of the people in the global South, that say no to this war and no to all wars. Thank you.
Thank you, Medea. How y'all feeling?
All right.
Good. We got to keep the energy up, and we got to keep the very real hope that we are historically predestined to win. We are predestined to win. Capitalism, imperialism have proven not to work. Internationally, people are awakening to that. Domestically, people are awakening to that. What are we going to do with that energy, and what are we going to do with people waking up? What are we going to do? We're going to organize. Because we can't win if we don't organize. We're going to agitate. We're going to mobilize. And we're going to change the game. All right? All right. All right, familia. So we have the pleasure and the honor to be able to, and thank you so much, Kay, for that. That was, woo, okay. We have the pleasure and the privilege to be able to have one of our comrades who has been, he's a reference in the internationalist movement. He's also been a part of building continental, regional articulations to make sure that social movements are in conversation with each other and that we are working in unity. He is part of the national coordination of the landless peasant movement in Brazil, the MST, which I have to say, it is the largest movement of our continent with over 1 million in membership. And we're not even talking about folks that are part of the network of the MST that are informally part of the MST. And so we are very privileged to be able to hear from him today. We hope that you all are able to follow the captions, but listen really closely to the message, because we got to learn from people that are doing it. In this country, unity, the unity of our class is a precondition for us to be able to advance anything. And so the MST has definitely worked on that. So without further ado, João Pedro este líder.
Compañeras y compañeros de organizaciones populares y del pueblo de Estados Unidos de América. Vengo aquí en nombre de los militantes del Movimiento Sin Tierra MST de Brasil, pero también de los movimientos populares de Latinoamérica, que los coordinamos alrededor de ALBA Movimientos, que es una articulación continental que tenemos desde hace años. Supe de vuestra buena idea de realizar una movilización contra la guerra de Ucrania y por la paz. Es casi pedantismo recordarles de que la guerra de la Ucrania es parte solamente de un juego de la geopolítica internacional que el gobierno y las empresas de Estados Unidos intentan recuperar su hegemonía en el mundo después que perdieron la iniciativa para China y para el grupo de los BRICS. El intento y el desarrollo de la guerra es solo una forma de los capitales de Estados Unidos fomentar un mercado más para la industria bélica y de ahí lograr reactivar el crecimiento económico interno. Pero también tiene un objetivo geopolítico, en verdad, de enfraquecer China en el tablero mundial, atacando a sus aliados y provocando para que ella también se mueva. Lastimadamente, esa guerra patrocinada por Estados Unidos, utilizando el instrumento de OTAN, se utilizó de un gobierno de clara vocación nazista, como es Zelensky, un marionete puesto ahí por las manipulaciones de la antigua embajadora de Estados Unidos en Kiev. Y en ese sentido era el gobierno del este más alineado a los Estados Unidos y que podría participar de ese tipo de provocación militar. Ahí estamos. Una guerra donde solo gana la industria bélica americana. Perdimos todos los pueblos del mundo y sobre todo el pueblo ucraniano está pagando con vidas. ¿Qué bandera hemos defendido en nuestros movimientos populares en busca de la paz? Primero, hay que condenar todas las operaciones bélicas donde sea. Hay que condenar la OTAN. La OTAN ya no tiene necesidad de existir. Solo se quiere hacer guerra. Hay que condenar la existencia de cualquier base militar extranjera en cualquier país, siendo que Estados Unidos tiene más de 800. ¿Para qué? Y para construir un clima de paz en el mundo, hay que buscar nuevas arquitecturas institucionales con más representatividad, donde participen no solo gobiernos, pero la sociedad civil, los movimientos populares, las iglesias, las entidades de derechos humanos. Porque las Naciones Unidas y la OEA ya no sirven para nada como zeladoras de la paz. Por eso me alegro que ustedes salen a las calles y se movilizan, porque no basta defender un programa por la paz. Nadie nos escuchará, menos aún los gobiernos. La única forma de los movimientos populares y los pueblos actuaren activamente por nuestra bandera de la paz contra la guerra es ir a las calles, como nos enseñaron la historia de las luchas de clases del mundo, y ustedes ahí tuvieron el gran ejemplo de Martin Luther King. Un gran abrazo a todos y a todas. Hola, compañeras y compañeros de organizaciones populares y del pueblo de Estados Unidos de América.
He was so good, we wanted to play it again. Thank you all for listening. Yeah, we're going to come back. So as João Pedro mentioned, I think it's important, and we mentioned it at the rally, that we're actually reclaiming, we are freeing Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King from the hands and the grip of the ruling class, who only teach us about the American dream speech, the I had a dream speech, not anything post that. Martin Luther King was very clear about the evils of society. And he was very clear about three main evils of society in his context, because those have evolved. And we must now talk about the environmental crisis and the devastation that has been caused by capitalism, because capitalism has caused that. But he spoke very clearly around capitalism, white supremacy, and imperialism. And he was very clear in speaking about war as the enemy of the poor and working class, and the need for us to be able to connect our struggles at home with imperialist war. Because the same levels of extraction that happen from the resources in our communities is a type of extraction that happens in a worldwide level when you're talking about war. And so if we are to reclaim Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King, we should be clear about what his message and his work was and why he was assassinated. And he was assassinated because he touched the very fiber of this country, which is capitalism. And his work was to unify the working class. Black, Latino, Asian, white, working class people fighting together against a system that dehumanizes us. Not only domestically, but also internationally. And so we are very, very honored to be able to reclaim his legacy today and be in conversation with two great comrades, amazing journalists. I want to introduce Eugene Perrier. This is when you clap. It's okay to clap. Journalist, with host in Breakthrough News, author, I'd like to add historian. If you want to know anything about history, you can ask Eugene. Also a member of the Answer Coalition and member of the Central Committee of the Party for Socialism and Liberation. So give it up for Eugene. And I have the honor of introducing great thinker, friend, comrade, organizer, Brian Becker, who has a long history of anti-war work, one of the founders of the Answer Coalition, and also one of the founders of the Party for Socialism and Liberation. Also a journalist. If you haven't listened to the Socialist Program, please do so. If you want to learn more about the history, both Eugene and Brian have material in that in Breakthrough News, and you could feel free to share that with folks who don't necessarily have the history and are allowing the U.S. narrative to be the ones to occupy the mental terrain of our people. So thank you for being with us. We had an amazing march, and we obviously called out the U.S. role in this conflict. And the media tells us they want to overcomplicate the thing and kind of get us to think, to believe that this conflict was initiated by Russia, right? Can you share a little bit more about how we can combat that narrative, one, but also, is it really that complicated to understand the U.S. role in this conflict, given history?
Me?
Go ahead. You look like you wanted to start, Brian.
Sure?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, what can I say? Who speaks first? Always a question. No, well, I think that, the number one way to combat it is just go to history and reality. Because obviously, the narrative that exists. Can people hear me in the back? Okay. Obviously, the narrative that exists is more or less, I don't know what day, February 24th, like that everything started on February 23rd of 2022, and everything prior to that is completely and totally irrelevant in terms of understanding what happened. But the reality is there have been extensive moves, actually starting in 1989, of the United States to press up against the borders of Russia and to do whatever it could, in the words of the U.S. national security strategy, so-called Wolfowitz Doctrine in the early 1990s, to quote-unquote demilitarize Russia and to more or less say it could play no role inside of Europe or inside of world politics other than that to be subordinated to the broader sort of global reality of the United States. There's a lot more that could be said here, but I think the important thing to recognize is, again, right at the very beginning, as the Soviet Union starts to collapse, you can see all of the conversations in the State Department, in the Department of Defense, about their biggest fear. And their biggest fear actually was peace. And they were talking very heavily, and if you want to get the whole details, I actually wrote an article about this a while back called "Is NATO Really to Blame?" Spoiler alert, yes. But nonetheless, they're talking about how peace is their biggest concern. Because they said, well, the problem we'll have if the Soviet Union collapses, or as it starts to fall apart, or really as the Warsaw Pact starts to recede, is that Germany and Russia might start to collaborate. They might start to have relations, and they might create a European security architecture, quote unquote, where they don't feel they need US troops anymore. And even worse, if it seems like there's peace in Europe, people in the United States won't want to spend as much money on the military because they will in fact perceive that, peace is good, peace is happening, and we don't need to spend all this money on war, and maybe we should start to think about how we can spend some of this money to build up the needs of working class people in the United States. And so the question that Brent Scowcroft, who was the national security advisor at the time, asked to his aides was, what can we do, the US, to get between Germany and Russia? And the whole discussion is, how do we manipulate anti-Russian feelings in Central and Eastern Europe to create a role for the United States? Now, fast forward, all this time, Russia is warning the United States. Mid-1990s, early 2000s, in 2008, I believe it was, Lavrov even said to some American officials that he was talking to, diplomatic officials, if you guys keep going this way, like trying to add Ukraine to NATO, continuing to push forward, adding all these Eastern European countries, eventually it's going to get to a point where we're going to have to choose on whether or not we're going to go to war. So this is well documented in mainstream media and WikiLeaks and everything, that the US knew for over 2 decades that its entire strategy was likely to at least potentially provoke war with Russia, and that the closer they got up to the border, the more likely Ukraine was going to become a member of NATO, the more likely that there was going to be a conflict between the two. But they didn't care, because they had to prevent at all costs peace breaking out in Europe, the perception that the United States was no longer needed. And why? Because that would mean the US would have to start giving up its position as the country that tells all the other countries what to do. The so-called rules-based international order, where the US makes all the rules and everyone else is told to follow. But if Germany and Russia started to get together and added France, well, they might be too powerful to tell them what to do. And if they weren't fighting each other, people in the United States would say, well, that doesn't seem that bad. They can do what they want to do in Europe. We're going to do what we're going to do over here. And right away, the US unipolar order would start to erode and start to collapse because the ideological basis behind it would be gone and new potential counterweights, good, bad, or indifferent, would start to arise. So you can see from the very beginning the strategy since 1989 of the United States and NATO, since 1989, led us to this moment and shows that they have deep complicity because many, many warnings were thrown aside because what matters to the ruling class of the United States is ruling the world, telling everyone else what to do, and nuclear war, millions of people dying, that all becomes subsidiary to those greater roles. So that's a little bit of it, I think, in terms of the real responsibility of NATO here.
Thank you. And thank you, Eugene. And I think Eugene is correct. And I think those of us who are here recognize in large measure that NATO and the US actually are to blame and are responsible, that this was a situation where even in the months leading up to the Russian invasion, right before February 24th, 2022, the US was predicting that Russia was about to invade. Do you all remember that? They kept saying, yeah, Russia's going to invade. And those of us who were watching said, no, that's war propaganda. And the Russians said, no, we're not going to invade. They completely denied it. As a matter of fact, the spokeswoman for the Russian Foreign Ministry made sarcastic jokes about whether or not Russia was about to invade and sort of mocked Anthony Blinken and Jake Sullivan. But indeed, Russia was planning to invade if the United States didn't take the negotiations with Russia seriously, because Russia had made it clear that they had red lines. And those red lines were very simply that Ukraine, once it became part of NATO, would be the place where the US, and it's the US, not really NATO, it's really the Pentagon, would position very advanced nuclear missiles that had a flight time of 5 or 6 minutes to their Russian targets at the Russian-Ukrainian border. And those kind of missiles, once positioned there, would mean that Russia would actually have no capacity to defend against those missiles. Now, does that mean that the US would actually start a nuclear war because it had missiles on the Ukrainian-Russian border? Not necessarily. What it would mean, though, for sure, is the US could always threaten Russia with an existential menace such that Russia would be wiped out in the event of a confrontation. And those missiles, by the way, were initially placed in Europe in 1982, and that was what inaugurated the anti-nuclear and nuclear freeze movement in Europe, because the US put missiles all around the Soviet Union. They completely encircled the Soviet Union with intermediate range missiles that had a flight time of 6 minutes to their target. And every missile that the US put all around Soviet Union targeted a Soviet political office. So what the US constructed, what the Pentagon constructed, was what is called the decapitation strategy. And the Soviets were so concerned about it, they were quite sure that there was going to be a war between the US and the USSR in the mid-1980s. And many people in Europe thought the same. Millions of people went into the street and built that anti-nuclear movement. And in 1986, Reagan, who at the time we considered to be the most right-wing, most militarist, most, maniacal war, whatever, find the right adjective, he came to the table with Gorbachev, signed an arms agreement banning those kind of missiles from Europe. And that was the Intermediate Nuclear Range Treaty that the United States just ended, unilaterally withdrew from 3 years ago, meaning that the US can go back to putting those missiles with its decapitation strategy in nearby places to Russia In this case, it would mean Ukraine. And if you have missiles targeting each and every one of your political offices, which is what it would be, every office in every city, in every town in Russia would be targeted with short-range missiles that had a flight range of about 400 to 500 miles to up to 800 miles, loaded with nuclear warheads. Under those circumstances, Russia could be decapitated, meaning its political leadership wiped out. So Russia says to the United States, this is a red line. Can you imagine if Russia did this to the United States, in Mexico, at the U.S.-Mexican border, or the U.S.-Canadian border? Would the U.S. ever permit that? I mean, just asking the question obviously answers the question. They would never allow it. So here you had back a year ago, Russia saying, we're amassing troops, these are red lines, negotiate with us, and Antony Blinken and Sullivan and Biden said, yeah, we think they're going to invade. Yeah, they're going to invade. No sense of alarm about the idea that the Russians were about to invade. And the reason there was no sense of alarm, and the reason that there was no effort to go back urgently to the negotiating table, is the U.S. wanted Russia to do what Russia has done. Because once Russia is engaged in Ukraine in this kind of war, and the U.S. is actually coordinating the Ukrainian military, and the U.S. has advanced capacity, as we know, as a military power, they believe that Russia could not win, and that in fact they could defeat Russia. They could smash Russia. They could deal a sort of fundamental military blow to Russia. And that would have the effect of scaring China, intimidating Iran, intimidating Venezuela, because if you can actually defeat Russia, a country that's so big, the largest landmass in the world, doesn't that mean that you can go to war and destroy any other entity? Doesn't it signal the rest of the world that the U.S. is willing to play even nuclear war chicken in order to achieve its military means? That's what's happening, sisters and brothers. That's exactly what's happening. The U.S. wanted this war, and they are very happy about the war, and they are very happy also that there's no anti-war movement. And why is there no anti-war movement, meaning until today? Because it's Ukrainians who are dying instead of people from the United States. If it was American soldiers who were dying, this would be Vietnam, but it would make Vietnam look like a tea party because the foe would be Russia, not Vietnam. And instead of having hundreds or some thousands of people in the streets right now, we would have millions of people in the streets because everyone would know that this is crazy and that the United States is not going to send its sons and daughters in an unnecessary war of choice to fight against Russia. But that's where we are. It's hard to build an anti-war movement right now because it's a proxy war. The lesson that the United States learned from Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan is have other people do the dying, have other people do the bleeding, have other people do the suffering. Because if it's Americans, there's going to be a huge anti-war movement. That's our problem. That's the thing that we have to overcome. What we did today, and it's not just the Answer Coalition or the People's Forum, there's a wide coalition of organizations that are involved in this, and there needs to be more. The reason this is hard is it's improperly presented to the U.S. public that this is somehow a noble cause to help the poor Ukrainians against the big monster aggressor Russia. And on the surface, it kind of seems that way. That's why this clever manipulation, Machiavellian strategy by the Pentagon in the U.S. is so difficult for us to stand up against. So what do we do? What do we do? We can either say this is a hard slog, it's going to be more difficult, we can't do it, let's focus on other things, or we can be like some of the so-called socialists are now forming groups in solidarity with Zelensky and Nato, apparently. We could do that. Isn't that a convenient way to get around the problem that is presented by this war, which is just go along with it? Just go along. Speak less. Shut up. Be silent. You know, I wasn't mentioning any names, but I heard somebody say Howie Hawkins. I don't know. It's possible. But here's the thing. We're in a battle. Our wing of the anti-war movement is in a battle. We are anti-imperialists. We are in solidarity. We don't. We're not happy that Russia and Ukrainians are fighting each other. 30 years ago, they were one people in the Soviet Union fighting for socialism. And as socialists, we understand that during the entire existence of the Soviet Union, the Ukrainian and Russian people fought together against reaction, against Nazism, and for the benefits of socialism. They fought together. So this is a terrible tragedy that they're fighting. But having said that, we don't say a plague on both your houses when we understand that U.S. imperialism manipulated the situation, created the situation, wants the war, wants to escalate the war, and it's not our war. Just like Vietnam, like Afghanistan, like Iraq, like every war, this is a rich man's war. This is a war for Wall Street. This is a war for the military-industrial complex. So that's our task, sisters and brothers. Hard? Yes. Will we do it? Yes.
Brian has dropped the mic. Thank you. Thank you, Brian. So, I mean, one of the things that the U.S. government does continuously, as you were mentioning, is remove us from the impact of the war, right? Like, you don't need to worry about it. We got it. And we're actually defending democracy. And we're actually defending the poor Ukrainians, right? That's the narrative that they sell us. Do we really know the impact of the war? Do we really know the impact of the sanctions? And I would like for you both to speak a little bit more about that. How does this war impact the working class internationally so that it doesn't seem so removed from us? And how do the sanctions impact us internationally as well? So I'd like Eugene to start, and then Brian, you could go ahead.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a good question. I think that all you really have to do to look at how it impacts the working class is to see that in essentially every single country anywhere on earth, there's a massive cost of living crisis that's going on. There's a lot of things that feed into the cost of living crisis, but of course the war in Ukraine is one of the main issues. And there's an important way to understand this, because when you look at the issue of inflation and the cost of living crisis, all of that is manufactured, right? Because everything is produced for profit. So someone is deciding what the price is going to be. So it's not as if there's just some like magical like gravity or something like that. Like you just throw it up and it comes down, like inflation is just happening. People are manipulating the realities in the world in order to increase their profits. When you look at a study that was done in the middle of last year, or maybe it was the year before, I don't know, but recently, about this very issue, 54 cents out of every dollar of inflation is corporate profits. So you have to understand that in the context of the, quote unquote markets, which is how all these things work. It's not as if there's actually a shortage of oil or a shortage of food per se. There are disruptions to the flow of oil, and there's disruptions to the flow of food. But what happens is when you have a major producer of oil, petroleum products, and many different fertilizers, wheat, different things, like Russia and also like Ukraine, they have a huge impact in terms of how futures and other things like that are traded, right? Because all these things, oils, they're commodity markets, they're manipulated. And so in the same way that a 54 cents out of every dollar of inflation can be profits, It's not supply chain issues. But most people who run corporations know the average person doesn't know anything about what things cost. So they can say, oh, it's the supply chain, things are backed up in the ports, oh, it's the war in Ukraine, so on and so forth, and they can use that to jack up the prices so they can make a huge amount of money, and that's exactly what's happening. So you have a situation that even when food is available, this is really what's happening with wheat and fertilizer, the price starts to go up so much that in most of the countries of the global south, people cannot afford it. Also in the global north, you can see right now what's happening with people's energy bills and pieces like that. Why is Con Ed saying they have to increase for people who live in New York 28% the cost of fuel? It definitely should boo, and the reason why is they're doing it because they can. Because they know that a lot of people won't question it because they'll say, oh yeah, the war in Ukraine and all these different things is disrupting all these different pieces. So what you have with the sanctions regime is it creates a perfect storm for the profiteers who run the world markets and all of these different commodities to continue to jack up prices extraordinarily high. So it's ultimately good for them. U.S. oil companies are making off like a bandit right now, and it's bad for the people of the world. So there are many other ways that there are repercussions that are taking place in relationship to this, but I think the number one is the cost of living crisis, and we can see very clearly how the sanctions are now being manipulated by the ruling class of the world to jack up the prices. Because if they wanted to, they could put a cap on all prices of all commodities and say, well, you just can't charge any more than we say you can charge. What they also could do is they could say, well, since we're already making huge profits, we could just make less huge profits, like we could go from gargantuan profits to huge profits and eat those cost increases so that the price wouldn't go up. They could also do that. But why would they do that when the goal of capitalism is to make as much money as possible, as much profit as possible for the people who own the businesses and the corporations, no matter what the impact is on the broader world, the broader working class, the broader oppressed people on Earth? So they're taking advantage of the situation in a major way in order to do so, and some of that is planned. I mean, you look at how the sanctions, how they've saved all these American companies that are selling oil to Russia. Now, does that seem, to Europe, does that seem like a coincidence? Doesn't seem like a coincidence to me. Because Russia is actually selling more oil now than it used to in the past because the prices are low because they're sanctioned. But they can't sell it to certain areas, mainly Europe, where they have a lot of money, and all of that trade is being taken over by these major US corporations. So, you know, it's not even, some of it is actually that cynical, I think. Some of it is related to the broader geopolitical goals, but it all comes together to create this perfect storm that is creating a massive cost of living crisis in every single corner of the globe. So if you say, how do we start to reduce prices? How do we start to reduce inflation? Well, certainly ending the sanctions on Russia is one. Also ending the sanctions on Venezuela is another. Also ending the sanctions on Iran is another. Because all of these things are used and manipulated in order to drive up the cost of the things we need to survive.
There's another element of this that's a little bit hidden in this process, which is the U.S. has attempted to evict Russia from the world economy. Russia's a major oil and gas producer. That means the U.S. is convincing or trying to convince or pressure Europe, as Eugene is mentioning, not to buy Russian petroleum products. The U.S. is also, the politicians are also concerned that if the gas prices in the United States are going to go up a lot, people who are driving their cars, and that's most people in the country who require automobiles to get to work, et cetera, they'll feel the cost of the war in their wallet. The cost of the war will impact their quality of life. So the politicians, one, don't want the people in the United States to feel any cost of the war, not just not having to send our sons and daughters to the front lines. They don't want the price of gas to go up. So they're evicting Russia, a major world oil producer, from the world market, from the Western oil market. So what must they do? What they must do then is to get other people to produce more oil. So at the very moment that the Biden administration was saying, look, we're looking for a Green New Deal. We're looking to try to stop climate change. We're trying to keep the carbon in the ground. We're trying to go to renewable energy sources rather than rely on oil. The actual policy of the U.S. government is the exact opposite because it's demanding that more and more oil be produced from other countries and in the United States to counteract the impact of their own sanctions on Russian oil. So if you care about climate change, this is another reason why you should oppose this war. You talk about impact, because this war is accelerating the production of oil and gas and other petroleum products in order to satisfy U.S. geostrategic machinations in Europe and against Russia. But who's going to pay the price? In 10 years, whether Ukraine, whether the Donbass is part of Russia or not, the climate, the planet is going to be 10 degrees, well, not 10 degrees, it's considerably warmer. Unless we keep the carbon in the ground, all of us are going to be vanquished, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of race, regardless of where you're from. The planet is the planet. We are the human family that happens to inhabit this space, and we're destroying this space. So if you care about the human family in any or all of its parts, you should also oppose this war because it's accelerating climate catastrophe. And finally, the Pentagon before the war, during the war, and after the war, unless we get rid of this system, is the greatest polluter and the greatest contributor to climate catastrophe of any other institution on the face of the planet Earth.
You know, one other quick thing I just want to mention, you know, the acceleration of the cost of living crisis in the global south means an acceleration of the immigration crisis. And I call it a crisis because people are trying to flee for their lives to make a better lives for themselves, and they're being brutally attacked, basically murdered in places like the Mediterranean, also, of course, on the southern border. But it's worth noting here that if you're a refugee from Ukraine, they've created an entirely new situation by which you can come in ways that are unprecedented. I mean, it just came out, the Polish border police tweeted out this past week how they're very happy 9 million some odd Ukrainians have passed through the border of Poland into other parts of the EU. And it really caught my eye because just before this war, the Polish border guards were beating back immigrants, brutally beating them back, who are coming from Iraq, who are coming from Syria, who are coming from other parts of the Middle East. So we're in a situation that this cost of living crisis is also escalating the need of more people in the global south to flee for their lives. And I think that's what we should call it. Because if you have to leave where you are from in order to just have enough to eat for you and your loved ones, that is fleeing for your life. So millions more people are going to be put in this situation as the militarization of the borders in the US and Europe becomes even more intense. And I said it before and I'll say it again. You know, Marjorie Taylor Greene's so-called anti-Ukraine war, go look at her speech. She said the reason why it's so bad is it's starving the border of money. And we should send the money from Ukraine to the Border Patrol to further militarize the US border. So in fact, even the so-called anti-war voices in Congress actually just want to turn the guns in a different direction, and they want to kill more people who are being forced to flee because of the impact of US policies. And I think that's a really important factor when we look at this, because the double standard is unbelievable in how people are being treated. And I'm all for all refugees being treated well, with respect, to have housing, to have access to health care. But the fact that Zelensky, the so-called freedom fighter, has not had one word to say about the people who are dying every single day crossing the Mediterranean. There's a trial going on right now, of individuals who had boats who were going into the Mediterranean to rescue immigrants. And they're being tried, I think it's in Italy, it might be in Spain, they're being tried for rescuing people from drowning to death. Where's the freedom fighter there? He didn't mention that at the Golden Globes. Wasn't mentioned at all in the Congress. When they had the little flag that was signed by people, wasn't signed by any of them. So we have to look at this form of hypocrisy very seriously, because I think it exposes the whole fraudulent nature of what this conflict is allegedly about.
So what does the future look like in relationship to this war? Like, what are some of the possible scenarios that we could expect? And I would like to add also the question of peace, right? We've been talking about peace the whole day, but we're talking about a certain type of peace, not the peace that usually the ruling class kind of likes for us to give them, but the type of peace that has a last name to it, which is justice, which is anti-imperialist, which is anti-capitalist, right? When we're talking about the future possible scenarios in relationship to the war, I'd like to hear a little bit more about that, but also what is our role in this creation of peace that has a last name to it, that is anti-imperialist, that is anti-capitalist, that actually is founded in the understanding of a solidarity that binds the lives of the global South with us, the working class here in the North. So if you could share a little bit about that, that would be great.
So wars end a couple different ways. One side wins, the other side loses. There's surrender conditions are imposed on them. So side A wins or side B wins. Another way is that both sides exhaust each other in a protracted conflict, and at the end of this exhausting process, they come to some sort of compromise. Those are basically it. In the case of Korea, the U.S. wanted to end the Korean War because the Koreans were willing, like the Vietnamese, to fight and fight and fight until the U.S. was driven out of Korea. And the U.S. couldn't win the war in Korea. That was the first war it lost. And so the U.S. told the North Koreans and the Chinese that they were about to begin dropping nuclear bombs all over China and all over North Korea. This is a true fact. It's in the book, Michio Kaku's book, To Win a Nuclear War. It's from declassified documents. And under those circumstances, the North Koreans signed an armistice agreement. This was another way a war could end. And then the U.S. refused to sign a peace treaty. So the conflict ended in the face of the threat of nuclear genocide. And here we are in 2023, 70 years later, and there's no peace treaty in Korea, which is used as a pretext by the U.S. to continue the sanctions and the threats against North Korea. So there's different ways a war can end. How will this war end? If you look at the media, and Eugene and I have been talking about this for months, we read all of not only the general papers, but the specialty papers and the Pentagon documents and the intelligence documents that are made available at least. It's quite clear the U.S. is not going to stop the war. The U.S. has no intention of negotiating a deal with Russia. None. There's no, right now, Medea mentioned Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, said, let's negotiate now because Ukraine might get weaker. He's one voice, but he's kind of almost a lone voice, and he might have just really been saying it to say it, to go on record as if he's for negotiations when they're really not. The war is not going to end because the U.S. is going to negotiate, and Russia is determined not to lose because this is an existential war. Like if Russia loses, they feel that's going to be the end of Russia, that Russia will be dismembered. Russia is a big country. It's got lots of ethnicities, lots of different languages, lots of different cultures. It can be broken up. Yugoslavia was broken up. The Soviet Union was broken up. Czechoslovakia became Czech and Slovakia. Countries can get broken up. The U.S. would like to break up Russia and China so they're not facing major powers. They're facing broken up, sort of balkanized minor powers. So that's the situation, everyone. The war is not going to end right away because the U.S. won't negotiate. Even Russia carrying out these new missile strikes against Ukrainian infrastructure, this escalation by Russia, it's not the escalation like what shock and awe invasion of Iraq was, where the U.S. came in and destroyed all of Iraq. Russia didn't do that. Russia is now escalating its attacks against civilian infrastructure like electric grids because they're hoping to force Ukraine to the negotiating table. And maybe a lot of Ukrainians are like, yeah, let's go to the negotiating table. Who cares about Crimea at this point? Who even cares that much about Donbass? Let's end the damn war. Wouldn't that be like a majority sentiment, you would think, among Ukrainians? I bet it is. But the U.S. doesn't want that. The U.S. doesn't want that, and the U.S. is insisting through their puppet, Zelensky, that they're only going to escalate the war. So Eugene and I have been talking for the last 9 months, really, that the logic here is escalation. If one side is determined to win and the other side is determined not to lose, that means there will be escalation. What does escalation look like? The U.S. has 5,000 operational nuclear weapons. On a Trident submarine, the submarines have missiles capable of destroying. One submarine has the missiles capable of destroying, in one launch, 120 cities. You got that? One submarine, and the U.S. has many, many of these submarines, and they are constantly prowling the 7 seas. One submarine can take out 120 cities. The U.S. has intercontinental ballistic missiles. It has the Air Force-based missiles, B-1, B-2, B-52 bombers. We're moving in the direction of a confrontation with Russia that will escalate, and these two powers are the greatest nuclear powers in the world. Doesn't that shock you that when you think about the possibility that the U.S. could be actually in a nuclear war which, once started, will end humanity as we know it, and there's not a great sense of alarm? There's not people like, wait, what the hell is this? What are we doing? Is this about Donbass? About Crimea? Crimea and Donbass were historically part of Russia. Like, what's so bad? Compared to nuclear war, I mean, the rational logic here is so obvious, but rationality and logic are gone because war hysteria dominates people's thinking and consciousness. So in terms of what we should do, we have to recognize that this is the fight of all fights, and it will easily and quickly morph into Taiwan and China. And we're not saying this because we're trying to be hyperbolic. We're not filled with gloom and doom. We're trying to be a realistic, socialist, anti-imperialist, anti-war movement. So we have our tasks cut out for us. We have to continue to find ways to build this. I think Europe, Eugene, you can jump in here and say what you think. I think it's very likely that this consensus will start to erode, especially in Europe. And there will be more and more anti-government positions and more anti-war positions. But if the left does not take the lead in the struggle against the imperialist war, the right wing kind of fascist elements like Marjorie Taylor Greene will. And the same in Europe, where there's a big fascist movement. That's why the left has to speak out, speak clearly, speak in a way that can actually reach people. This is not the time for rhetoric. This is not the time for shrill, like niche subculture left politics where we are like trying to please our friends on Twitter by showing how radical we are. Now is the time to really fashion arguments to be able to speak to our coworkers, our family members, our friends, if we're in a religious institution, the people in that congregation, and our campuses, our high schools. We have to be able, we're in the beginning of a big, very big project and a very serious project. So we're gonna obviously continue to fight for higher wages and against the evictions. We're going to fight for affordable health care. We have to fight for all the things the working class in the U.S. needs, but we can't do that and turn away from the reality of the danger of this escalating into major power conflict, which would change the world in a horrible, awful way, that we have to be able to put this at the center, not in some peripheral way, into the agenda of all of the anti-war, anti-imperialist, and socialist organizations.
I mean, yeah, I don't have a lot to add. I mean, I think that it's not an existing danger in Europe. It's already happening. I mean, there's big demonstrations all the time in France, for instance, where they're raising this issue of get out of NATO. But they're all organized by, I don't know, my French is not that good, Florian Philippot, I think is his name, who, would shoot any immigrant on sight in the street if the possibility arose, like truly the most execrable individuals. But they're able to use the cost of living crisis as a Trojan horse to some degree because people are in dire need. And let's be honest, it wouldn't be the first time that the negative repercussions of a war were used by the right for malign purposes in Europe. And how did that end up the last time? And I think certainly we have a extra responsibility because there is an intense effort on the part of a certain subset of so-called liberals, so-called Democrats, to do everything possible to prevent there being any progressive opposition to this conflict. There is an aggressive attempt to silence people, to bully people, to push them off, to write them out, all these other pieces, which means that what we see is the most prominent voices are these people who are, like I said, are cynically taking advantage of this particular circumstance to do something else that is equally bad, if not worse, depending on what we're talking about. But those are the voices that we are, in fact, hearing. And most of those are fake anyway. Kevin McCarthy is not going to do anything with the Ukraine funding. He might have said whatever he was going to say. He will do nothing. You can write that down. Eugene Perrier said, Kevin McCarthy will do nothing on Ukraine funding. Come back to me in 2 months and tell me I'm wrong. You won't be able to. In fact, I would say if you want to bet me money, I would be okay with that because I'd be happy to take it, but I don't want to be unscrupulous. But all you have to do is look at the conversation they just had last week where they were freaking out about the potential of 2% defense cuts, and they all came up to put their hand on their heart and say how great it was and how they're going to have $10 trillion for nuclear weapons. So that we know is all fake. But nonetheless, if we want people to feel strong like they can stand up, that means that we have to develop the type of arguments that speak to the things that are making them feel they cannot speak out. And I think those are the important things that we have to do moving forward, and I think that is our role, and I think Brian already spoke to it, is we have to really engage aggressively in the battle of ideas. And we have to recognize that a lot of people who agree with us on 90% of the things are disagreeing with us on this. That doesn't mean to put them to the side, and it's one thing to say how you look on Twitter and looking good for your friends, but also trying to silence people who you think don't stand up, meet up to your standards. And unfortunately, that is something that a lot of times with controversial issues, it feels good to say, I'm standing up for what's right no matter what else is wrong. And other people who can't do that, well, that's on them. But the reality is that's not realistic. So we have to be thinking very carefully here that if we don't find ways to craft a true agenda against imperialism and against war that speak to people who have a sense that it's wrong, who are critical of the military budget, who've been critical of past wars, but they feel they cannot speak because ultimately this is a different situation, or this person is, someone actually even tried to troll me today on Twitter saying that Putin is worse than Osama bin Laden. I mean, I just, you don't even know what to say, right? But like, these are the types of things that are being thrown out there that it's, that's difficult, and if you don't know all the ins and outs of this, that, and the third, and you don't know how many people died and this, whatever. So we have to be a resource for people. We have to be a bridge for people who have a sense that something is wrong, but still aren't 100% sure how to speak out, who are still looking for the right facts and the right formulations. We have to come up with ways that we can be a tool that people who know that they are right, but are afraid to go into the lion's den with people who know something else. What are the tools we're creating to make it easier for them to build those bridges to their friends, their families, their coworkers, their loved one, that we can continue to build this movement? And let's remember, now this is not to compare Russia to the National Liberation Front of Vietnam. That would be an unfair comparison to the Vietnamese strugglers. But I say that to say, in the early days, Vietnam was also heavily demonized. When Martin Luther King came out, and this is what we're here talking about, they said, how could you be for the Vietnamese? They're anti-democratic, they're authoritarian, they're murdering people, they don't have elections. I mean, almost the exact same things you hear right now. So the reality is that took some time to build up against that, to build up the arguments, to help people see. So that's the kind of situation that we're in. It's an uphill battle in some ways, but it's one that has to be fought, and that no one else but us is going to do. No Democrat's going to do it. The Squad's not going to do it. Most of these so-called anti-war groups in D.C. aren't going to do it. They're all afraid. And some of them might be afraid for good reason because they're worried about what's going to happen with their congressional pension or whatever when they get booted out of there. But the reality is we can't think like that. We have to think about what's best for the people of the world. and the working class people here in the United States, which is to oppose this war, to oppose imperialism, to oppose NATO. And it's gonna be tough, it's not gonna be easy. We're gonna have to hit our head against a lot of walls, but I don't think anyone would be in this room right now if you were looking for something that was super easy. I think it was probably difficult to come here today. And when someone said, what are you doing this afternoon at 2? What are you gonna say? All those sort of different things that brought us here, even though we knew it could be difficult, we have to continue with that momentum and continue with that mentality as we talk to other people everywhere we can, whenever we can, any moment we get to lift our voices, because there isn't going to be some savior riding in on mainstream media to try to change the narrative or the discourse on this one.
Wow, that's great. Thank you, Eugene. Thank you. And I know we're about to conclude here, and again, thank you to the comrades, to the friends from Boston who came down, and it was bad weather, rough roads. Thank you. Maine. We have folks here from Geneva, New York, the Finger Lakes, Western New York. New Haven, Connecticut. Group came from New Haven. D.C., Washington, D.C., Philadelphia. Did I say Philadelphia? Baltimore. Let's not forget Baltimore. Anybody else who's from New Jersey? Okay. So I want to finish. Who could forget Vermont? My goodness. All right. I want to make a point about, where we are. You never really know where you are in the historical continuum until later. I'm sure when Rosa Parks didn't give up her seat in 1955, she didn't know she was inaugurating the civil rights revolution that swept the country. But afterwards, everybody would say, well, we could see that coming. But she had no guarantee of anything when she took that very heroic stance and was arrested. You never know until later where you are, but you keep doing the things that must be done because they're the right things, because you believe in them, because you have commitment, and not because you know you're going to have immediate success. I'm sure Ms. Parks was doing that over and over and over again until that moment crystallized where, this conjuncture happens and things start to change. One other historical fact that I found weirdly ironical, and I only learned it today, so I want to share it with you. I learned it at 5 o'clock this morning when I was, of course, not sleeping properly. I was looking up the 1968 election returns. And why? Because I know you were. Because 1968 was a critical year for social change in the United States. It really was. It was when the country goes against the war in Vietnam. It's really the uprisings that take place after the killing of Dr. King, April 4th, 1968. 120 cities went up in flames, basically. There were insurrections all over America. Students were taking over campuses. I mean, it was a radical year. And 1969 was an even more radical year. And 1970, maybe as radical as 69. I don't know if anything could compare to 1969. But there was a near sort of civil war, in a way, in the United States. And for people my generation who were teenagers then, we all became revolutionaries because everybody else was a revolutionary, or it felt that way. So 1960, I went back and I looked at the election returns in 1968. It was Richard Nixon, right-wing, anti-communist warmonger against Hubert Humphrey, little less right-wing, still a warmonger. And there was a third candidate, George Wallace, who ran as an open white supremacist, open segregationist. Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. That was George Wallace's slogan in 1968, the same year. He won 5 states. He won the electoral vote in 5 states. George Wallace, running as an open fascist. Richard Nixon got 35 other states. He won the right-wing anti-communist, and Humphrey only won 10 states. Did you know that? Eugene, of course, knows this, because even though Eugene is not from the 60s, he knows everything about the 60s and the 40s and the 30s and the 1880s, et cetera, et cetera. So he probably knew this. I didn't know this, or I didn't remember it. But at this moment of radical change, bourgeois public opinion was still really not in our corner, as evidenced by the fact that George Wallace and Nixon got 40 of the 50 states in the 1968 election. And yet the radical changes took place. They didn't take place because we won at the ballot box. It's not because we convinced the majority of reactionaries not to be reactionaries. It was because of what we might call the militant minority, the millions of people who were as of yet not in the majority, not by a long shot, but were so militant, so determined, so committed to action, so unwilling to step back, that all of these historic changes, that's when expansion of democracy happens in the United States. It's during this period, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, affirmative action, eventually the women's rights movement and Roe v. Wade, the beginning of the Stonewall and the beginning of the LGBTQ movement. All of this happened in the same time that George Wallace and Nixon won 40 out of the 50 states. My point is, if you read the headlines in the bourgeois media, you'll think one way about what's possible. But if you build with our communities, with our people, keep struggling, keep determined, know that we're right, and know that the contradictions in capitalism, including this war, are irreconcilable contradictions, and we can organize, maybe not the majority at first, but enough people with enough militancy, enough commitment, that we really can make profound radical change on the road to making the real change, which is to get rid of the capitalist system once and for all. Thank you.
I get the sense that people are feeling ready. Are you ready? You ready? You ready to spread peace with the last name of anti-imperialism, anti-capitalism? Yeah? Peace with the last name of justice and liberation? I like that. I like y'all energy. Familia, thank you so much again for marching, for organizing friends and comrades to come from so many different places. We have comrades from Peru that are here as well. If you all, if you all don't know what's happening in Peru, you should know what's happening in Peru, because it's part of the imperialist agenda to be able to destabilize a lot of the progressive governments that have come into place due to movements in our continent. And so we have to keep our eyes on Peru. We have to keep our eyes on Brazil. We got to continue to fight against the blockade on Cuba. We got to continue to fight for the lifting of the sanctions in Venezuela. We have to continue to fight for integration, collaboration, negotiations, because that's been the only way of resolving conflict. War is a tool of our enemy. It has never served the purpose of the working class. It will never do so. And I want to uplift something that was said here during our conference in November. The only legit war is class war. That is the only legit war. And that is the only type of war that we should engage in. Now, there are some things that we are committing to. We are committing to building an anti-war movement that is an anti-imperialist anti-war movement. We are committing to educate, to organize, to mobilize. João Pedro said it best, The only way that social movements have been able to advance is taking up space, taking the streets. You know what I'm saying? I'm just giving some lines y'all don't have to follow if y'all don't want, but occupying space. Making it uncomfortable for people that are highly comfortable doing what they're doing. That's how historically we've won. And our people are further advanced than what we think, because they feel it in their lives, in their existence, that capitalism, imperialism, and all systems of oppression and exploitation are not the solution. They have questions that politicians aren't answering, and we need to intervene. Are we ready to intervene? Yes. Are we ready to engage in this battle? Yes. All right. So one thing, I'm going to take y'all to church. We need money to do this. If we're talking about building a movement, how many of you believe movement needs money? We do need money, because, you know, they've extracted all of our money. So we need money. And so we're going to be passing the bucket, and we're asking for folks to donate. Obviously, we marched today, but that meant permits, that meant sound systems, that meant a lot of stuff. And so there are some red buckets. IDs right there. I don't know if that's orange or red, but it looks like K is right here. If you are online, let me read this right. I don't got glasses, but I'll do my best. If you are online, you could, Leon, where's your text message? Okay. You could donate by texting Peace Today 44-321. That's the code for donations. Okay? Donate, text Peace Today to 44-321. Thank you all again for coming. We are not, because we said we committed to an hour, and we are a little bit over an hour. But we do invite folks to speak to each other. If you haven't made a friend yet that you don't already know, please do so before you leave the space. Again, we will continue to build this movement. We are happy that you are committing yourselves to continue on this path to peace. Thank y'all for coming. Y'all are amazing. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Eugene. And thank y'all, comrades, for coming from all places and those that have logged on.